I have to introduce my friend and colleague and collaborator and Lukoye Atwoli. It is my pleasure to introduce him, and he'll be speaking to us, I think, very appropriately about the impact of mental health and climate change, impact of climate change on mental health. So Lukoye Atwoli is younger than me. I just wanted to make that clear. Even though he looks like is a wise man who from Kenya, who grew up in Nairobi, and he is wise much beyond his age. He's famous psychiatrist in Kenya because he is outspoken and very vocal about everything there is to speak about in Kenya. I often wonder if he was born in Uganda, he would not be here today. Lukoye grew up in Nairobi, and I think we all got to meet him when he was in Eldoret as a psychiatrist and academic. He spent some time at UCT and being mentored by Dan Stein for his PhD, and he was I think that's when the trauma and epidemiology thing was ignited. And he's been involved as part of the World Mental Health Surveys, going to Boston every year, and the rest I really think is history. His publications have kind of just skyrocketed from there. He's learned how to play academic game. The soccer or football analogy, when you play in local football leagues, you can be really good, and then you get to be chosen to play in the United Kingdom, and then you just skyrocket, and the rest is history. So Lukoye's World Mental Health Series, epidemiological stuff, really made him become a global star. And you can read his bio on page 5, but the one thing I wanted to say we are particularly impressed by and particularly proud is that this young man was recently, this year, elected into the United States National Academy of Medicine, which I think is a huge deal. It's a huge deal. As you know, it's a peer review system. Someone within the academy has to nominate you, and it goes through a rigorous process, and I think everyone was very happy and approved Lukoye's nomination. So we're looking forward to this young man's talk this morning. And Karibu, Lukoye, you're welcome to South Africa. Thank you so much.
That's good. Yeah. Just have to figure out. Okay, it's very easy to just know. Forward is a green button. All right. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. It's always a pleasure coming back to Cape Town, to South Africa. Often I've been told that this looks like my second home, and I have many friends here. But it's also always a pleasure coming and speaking at this particular meeting because of the diversity, the variety, and the groups of people that this meeting attracts. So I'm very grateful that Bonga and your team invited me to come and speak today. So you may have noticed from the title of my presentation that I want to speak about moving from trauma to climate change. But this is really a story about the work that I have done, where I have come from, and where I am today, as far as mental health and climate change is concerned. So we have a Brain and Mind Institute at the Aga Khan University where I work. And over the past 3 days, we've had a meeting, and I was very honored to have Bonga attend this meeting and speak and participate in panels. The Brain and Mind Institute's tagline is from neurone to neighborhood. And this really frames what I would like to speak about today. It's about what's happening inside us and what's happening around us and how those are connected. And so today I'm going to give a little bit of a historical context because it's very relevant to the work that I have done that has led me to the climate work that I'm starting to do. And then how that connects from history to the present, and also it turns out that it links with what is happening in South Africa. And then just look at, after talking about brain health, mental health, and so on, what does a neighborhood have to do with it? And then move on to the current work that we're doing on climate change. So Kenya is an artificial construct, as are many countries in Africa that were colonized by European powers at the time. So the British came in the 1890s in Kenya and stayed in charge for 70 years, up to 1963, when we gained independence. At that time, because many people would ask, some people would ask, why do you go to a land that's far away from your own domain and purport to rule those people? But they had a policy, and the policy was to advance the backward tribes, that's the people who lived in the territory that is today called Kenya, to the utmost limits by British government, law, religion, and education. So this was the premise upon which the British purported to rule in Africa, and specifically in Kenya. And this policy was bolstered by work that was done by the scientists at the time, and their work actually demonstrated, in their view, the inferiority of the natives from the neighborhood, that is their social interactions, qualitatively, to the neuron, that is the brain structure and function. The previous slide clearly is not showing. But what I wanted to show on that slide was work that was done by a gentleman called John C. Carruthers. John Carruthers was a medical doctor trained in the United Kingdom who came to Kenya and was made in charge of the then mental hospital, Mathari Hospital, where today I chair the board. And he also, it turns out, became an amateur anthropologist and sociologist, and he wrote a monograph in which he purported to inform the world about the psychology of the Mau Mau. Now, for those who do not know, Mau Mau were the freedom fighters in Kenya who opposed British rule, took up arms, and fought against the British from around the late 40s up to the late 50s. And at the end of that period, because many of them were killed and many of them were arrested and incarcerated in concentration camps. And it is the treatment of these Mau Mau within the concentration camps that resulted in revulsion, even in the UK, that led ultimately to the freedom movement. And that scholarship by people like Carruthers, who wrote about the psychology of the Mau Mau and wrote about the African mind in health and disease, it's what legitimized the interventions by the colonial government. They said, as we told you, these people are inferior, and here is scientific evidence to prove this. I hope that moves. So this, unfortunately, is not going to show. But, yes, so that's the next slide. But the slide before that shows, it's all right, please. Just, leave that there for the time being. This is a publication in Nature. In 1933, December 23. And it's a comment on an article by a gentleman called H.L. Gordon, who wrote a scientific study that, again, confirmed what the colonial authorities always suspected. And this is that, firstly, if you measure quantitatively the brain sizes of Africans and compare them with the European, you'll find quantitative differences in the brain sizes. And so Gordon says, when he measured the brain of natives in Nairobi, he found that there are 1,316 cubic centimeters, as against the European average of 1,481 cubic centimeters. And so this demonstrates obviously that, and so there might be uncertainty about if you're measuring two brains and comparing just two brains, because that's unscientific. But he did 100 brains, all right? So this confirms the evidence of cranial capacity, giving an average weight 150 grams less than the average brain weight of the European. So that's very important. But there's a further quantitative inferiority in the brain. And this is now Vint. Vint was a pathologist who looked at the quantity. So, and says the cortex shows a deficiency of 15% in quantity. And in addition to that, the cells are smaller, less well arranged. I don't know what well arranged means. Less well shaped. I don't know what that means, than in the European brain. So our brains, cells themselves were uglier and smaller and stuff like that. But in addition to that, so the quality, so he says in quantity and quality, the Kenyan brain is inferior. And then the anthropologists have virtually abandoned any attempt to correlate the size of the brain with mental ability in view of the because at the time people were saying, does it even make sense? But these Kenyan or British Kenyan scientists demonstrated beyond all doubt the inferiority of the Kenyan brain. And there is Carothers again. So he moved on into ethnopsychiatry and talked about now, having studied the Mau Mau in detail, was now able to write for the World Health Organization about the African mind in health and disease. And he was highly qualified to do that at the time. And again, he cites this work by Vint, thus from both the average weight of the native brain and from measurements of his prefrontal cortex. So he measured the prefrontal cortex and arrived in that preliminary investigation at the conclusion that the stage of cerebral development reached by the average native is that of the average European boy of between 7 and 8 years of age. So I, standing before you at the time, would be operating at the level of a 7 or 8-year-old European boy. So the colonial establishment used this scholarship to justify the things that they were doing. So they in Kenya they did what was called villagization. So they kept natives in villages that were surrounded by fortifications, and anybody who tried to leave would fall into trenches that were spiked, or you'd be shot because they were trying to separate them from the Mau Mau in Nairobi and in central Kenya at the time. And so that is the context from which we are operating. So this is an example of when they were rounding up young and older men and sending them to the concentration camps at the time. So this gentleman is called Dedan Kimathi. He was the leader of the Mau Mau at the time. He was ultimately captured in the forest and executed for leading a rebellion against the British. And so all this continued until the late 50s. And in 1959, at a camp called, one of the concentration camps in a place called Hola, the detainees refused to do forced labor at that time. And when they did, the people who were managing the camp ordered the guards to beat them up, and they bludgeoned them with what we call rungus, clubs. And 13 of them died as a result of that. Now, news of these bludgeonings went out and got into the media, and the then Labour opposition in the United Kingdom raised this in Parliament, and they formed a task force that came to Kenya to do fact-finding, and they found that worse things had happened other than just the killings. And so from that, when they went back, filed a report, and it became the beginning of the British government being forced to leave Kenya. Now, why have I given you all this background? This background is that the formation of our nations, the formation of our countries in Africa was pretty traumatic. And the maintenance of those countries, even before independence, was very, very, had a lot of traumatic events that if they were happening today, all of us would agree that they would cause some damage. And so when I went to study psychiatry, I read all this history. I read The Wretched of the Earth by by Fanon. I read a lot of history around how Kenya came to be. And I found this group of people, the Mau Mau, and I asked myself, so after reading all the stuff that happened to them, where are they today? And this is in the mid-2000s. And I didn't find any literature on anything that had been done to figure out what their psychological fate was. And so I did a study on post-traumatic stress disorder among the survivors of those concentration camps almost 50 years later, and found that 2/3 of them had current symptoms of post-traumatic stress disorder at the time, not surprisingly. And the stories they told were pretty harrowing. And so this forms the frame of how Kenya came to be, and the frames within which Kenya has been forced to operate. And I speak of Kenya as an example of an African country that was colonized, that went through the things I have told you. And so many of the political leaders taking over at the time had been political prisoners and detainees as well. And most were completely unprepared for leadership. The only type of leadership they knew was what the colonialists had been doing. And the result, obviously, was that they used the same methods in managing the country, managing dissent, managing opposition. And so they continued the same things as a legacy of the colonial government. So in 2007, late 2007, early 2008, we had an election that was contested, and we fought, because that's how we deal with dissent, that's how we deal with disagreement, we fight. And we came very close to civil war in Kenya, and the international community was involved, and the UN and Kofi Annan and so on, all of them were involved, and they helped to bring us back to the negotiation table. We had a government of national unity, and things calmed down a little bit. And at the time, I was living in Eldoret in northwestern Kenya, and that was the epicenter of the conflict. Many, many people were killed in that area, and it was very difficult to operate there. But we had people who were internally displaced in Eldoret, and I organized mental health and psychosocial support for those groups. I led what the UN calls a protection cluster, and I collected some of the data that based on the work that we did, and we took care of about 80,000 people at that time in the small area in Eldoret. And many of them had a lot of distress and needed a lot of psychological interventions. And what are these conflicts about? So I kept, after reading history, looking at the present day and thinking about why these things happen. As why do we keep doing this? And I figured normal humans in groups who have enough of what they need will be unlikely to engage in the kind of conflict that we see in our part of the world. So limited resources have been the hallmark of all this conflict. Changing climate has, so in our part of Africa, migration was the norm. So we had pastoralists who would move from place to place depending on the weather, depending on availability of pasture and so on. And that was a norm. But with the coming of the colonial boundaries, then this was also restricted quite a lot. So limited resources, and then changing climate put additional pressure, increased the need to move within those constrained boundaries, and therefore increase the risk of conflict when the land ownership regime changed. So I own this land, and you can't come here with your cattle, even if I have enough pasture to take care of your animals. So that became one of the drivers of conflict. The second thing is perception as a result of the scarcity of resources, the perception of political power as a locus for resource allocation that benefits the individual who is in charge of power and their ethnic and religious associates is the second driver of conflict from where I sit. And poverty, socioeconomic inequities, which are indeed a legacy of colonialism, and I say that unashamedly, are key drivers of conflict, trauma, post-traumatic syndromes, and other mental disorders. And persistently, these conflicts are even being replicated at the family level. So children are being brought up in environments of extreme adversity on the continent. So I do a lot of advocacy around child education and discipline and so on. And I often ask groups of people about how do you get a child to do the things you think are the right things to do. And most people unthinkingly endorse physical violence against children as a method of discipline. And it's only after we have a discussion that then people know. So somebody says, just a little bit of spanking is fine. And ask, what is a little bit of spanking? Like, who gives a scale and says, you spank up to here, beyond here is violence. So we beat up our children in order to make them do the things we want them to do. And this is still, it's a product of how we ourselves were brought up and how we think about discipline. So I studied some children in adversity in Western Kenya, in Adress. And these are children who live on the street. They're street children in Adress. And we looked at substance use practices, and obviously a huge percentage of them endorse substance use, especially sniffing of glue, using substances that some are not mainstream substances that are made at home. But I thought this framework that is presented here on the left shows some of the factors that we thought lead to substance use problems, but also additional problems among these children. And most of these emanate, as you will see, from family conflict, problems in the home, again, scarcity of resources as a result of where people find themselves today. And so we looked at some of the effects of this environment that these children live in. And we find the children who are sexually abused in Kenya. And so if you look at the population of orphaned and separated children who even live with relatives, so we compared those who live with relatives versus those who live on the street versus those who live in foster homes, and we found a lot of those who live with relatives are sexually abused or sent out for sex trafficking in order to make money. And as a result, we found a high prevalence of post-traumatic stress disorder among those children as well. And so then I moved on to thinking a little bit more globally. And I did some work here in South Africa, which was more epidemiological, more general, and so on. And obviously, South Africa has a history that is more recently, potentially traumatic than Kenya's. More recently, I would say colonial than Kenya. And so traumatic events in South Africa have been a lot more public, a lot more state organized compared to the situation we have in Kenya today. And those traumas continue, those events continue post-apartheid. And so today we have a lot of criminal victimization, domestic violence, and a lot of traumas that are related to how people grew up and the environment that people grew up in this country. And so we looked at trauma and post-traumatic stress disorder in South Africa in general. And again, we found, almost 3/4 of South Africans will endorse at least one traumatic event or other, whether it happened to them or they witnessed. And those are the kinds of traumas that were endorsed in the South African Stress and Health Survey. As you will see, other than physical violence, what I found to be remarkable was witnessing. A fifth of the sample indicated that they had witnessed at least one traumatic event or other, and this was significant in the sense that it was related to the occurrence of post-traumatic stress disorder. So we looked at what problems do witnessing. So we went into witnessing and said, does this cause psychopathology? And of course, we found high prevalence of PTSD, depression, anxiety, and so on as a result of witnessing traumatic events. So at that time when we were doing this, the American Psychiatric Association and the makers of the DSM were thinking about removing the idea that witnessing trauma would be a potentially traumatic event. So they were talking more about something happening directly to yourself and so on, or to somebody very close to you. And we found here that the 20% who witnessed traumatic events had a huge conditional risk for post-traumatic stress disorder. And it went beyond post-traumatic stress disorder and also caused or was associated with chronic physical conditions, cardiovascular, respiratory, chronic pain, and so on. So what does this have, what does the neighborhood have to do with this? So I've laid the case, in my view, that we start from a place of extreme adversity, from a place of publicly experienced trauma, from a place of officially endorsed traumatic events, to having all the psychopathology that I have described. And I would argue that we are the most diverse space anywhere in the world. We argue with Bonga every time, and Vuiso, who I don't know if he's here yet, but we argue about where everybody came from. And Bonga says this is the, what did you say, the source or cradle? The cradle, yeah, the cradle. And we also argue that we have a space in East Africa where every human being can trace their origin from. It will probably be resolved by finding a different place other than East Africa. But this diversity is reflected on the continent in the variety of ethnic groups, races, religions, all sorts of groupings that you find on the continent. And scarcity causes people to band together, get into groups, and look at everybody else as a threat to their survival. And the result is fear. And when we have this fear, because we are thinking beings, then we feel the need to justify our fear. And once we justify our fear, it's only logical that the other people are terrible human beings. And so this justifies why we are afraid of them, because otherwise it would be irrational to be afraid of the other people. And once we have those justifications that those are terrible human beings, then we are even more afraid of them. And then we feel the need to continue to justify. So it spirals and spirals until we have conflict. And so we looked at, now globally, in the World Mental Health Surveys, people who live in the environment such as we do, where there is chronic and ongoing exposure to traumatic events, and found that if you have history of earlier trauma exposures, and then you get exposed to additional traumas, your risk of other mental disorders is also increased. But I put this slide on the right, this paper that we did on PTSD associated with natural and human-made disasters, to demonstrate that after we have experienced traumatic events and exposures, then we also cause disasters and we cause traumas to other people. And in South Africa, the work that we did showed that perpetrators of traumatic events were at extremely high risk of developing post-traumatic stress disorder themselves. What we didn't figure out is, was it because they had also been exposed to extremely traumatic events, and therefore this was associated with their perpetration, and therefore increasing their risk for PTSD. And so if we argue that trauma and causes of trauma, so I looked at that and said, if we are talking about scarcity, migration, and so on, So we decided to pay a little bit more attention to the environment. And to me, it is clear that a lot of the conflicts that we have are related to scarcities that are driven by constrained movement as a result of the colonial imposition of boundaries, but in reaction to changes in climate and our environment. And if you look at the world map of conflicts today, you'll notice that the regions most affected by climate change or shocks also suffer the highest volumes of conflict. And they have contributed the least to climate change, if you ask me. So we decided to start looking at those. So you can see the band of conflict. Until recently, I mean, it's very little in Europe and North America. And those are the biggest drivers of climate change. And the conflict is happening in the areas that are most affected, somewhere in the middle of that map. And so we looked at Africa, mental health and climate change in Africa. This became the reason why we started worrying about, other than the direct conflict caused by migration and so on, what other effects do we see? And we found, I mean, across the continent, there are things that are happening that are pushing people. People are supposed to move as they used to do traditionally, but they can't. And so they have to endure the effects of climate change, from West Africa, coastal areas flooding, to extreme heat in parts of the continent. All these causing problems, not only psychological problems, but also physical problems, as evidenced by women having adverse birth outcomes as a result of exposure to extreme heat on the coast of Kenya. And so, having painted a picture of gloom and doom, is there something that we can do? So we exercised our minds also about what can be done. And in 2020, when COVID-19 happened, we sat down and thought about, firstly, which population should we be focusing on? And we thought, if you're thinking about mental health and the future and thinking about climate, the population you need to focus on is for youth, firstly, the young people. And then we thought, is there things that can be done to start mitigating the effects of these changes in order to make our cities healthier? And so we came up with a framework when I was engaged with an organization called Cities Rise to make cities mental health friendly for young people. And so climate advocacy was a big deal even then with the young people, because we recognize that COVID-19 was an example of the things that happen when we are not in harmony with our environment. So we came up with this framework that looked at how do we design our cities, how do we create spaces within our cities where young people can just breathe and take time to think about the things that are important to them. And finally, the world has started congregating and thinking about what needs to be done. It's becoming more and more urgent to think about what actions should we take to mitigate the effects of climate change. And in 2021, before COP26, we did an editorial to talk about the need to limit temperature increases, restore biodiversity, and protect health. And this was published in more than 200 journals. Editors agreed on the need for this. And last year, before COP27 as well, we did another one because it was in Africa. The meeting was held in Africa, and we thought that we needed to focus on Africa. Africa as a space that has contributed the least to climate change, but that continues to suffer the greatest burden of climate change-related issues. And so I conclude by just summarizing that, yes, our history is littered with conflict, and this is caused largely by competition for resources from colonialism to the present day. These conflicts continue to cause trauma that harms us, from the brain function to social interactions, from the neuron to the neighborhood. And it has resulted in our world, where our children are growing up in extreme adversity, compounded by climate change. We compound climate change, and it compounds our lives and has made the world less habitable. I think we in mental health must use our platforms to advocate for action that preserves our environment and biodiversity. We must, because our voices do matter. And the message I think that we would take from a conference such as this one is that if we do not fix the neighborhood, our neurons are not protected. Thank you very much.
So thank you very much, Lukoye, for keeping to time. Really appreciate it. So which means we've got enough time to have questions. And there's a microphone.
Yeah.
There will be microphones roaming around. Where are the microphones? So maybe I'll start with the first question. We have enough time, so I'll start with the first question, but as you think of questions, please then raise your hands after that. And maybe it's a political one, because you gave a wonderful overview of the history and where we're coming from. The thing that struck to me was about the restriction of movement. The restriction of movement in Africa. And as a politician yourself, it'll be good for you to give us a little bit of thoughts about how do we intervene there, because clearly if these conflicts are around limited resources, then we should also be trying to advocate as advocates about what's happening in the moment. And I know that a few African leaders have been meeting to discuss such things, but I thought it would be wonderful for you just to give us some thoughts around that. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you. I think the concept of the modern state is rooted in Middle Ages European thought. This is not an African idea. So Africans did not, as far as I know, have the concept of ownership of the land. You wouldn't own the land on which you cultivated, on which you had your animals and so on. You knew that you are there only temporarily. And if a time comes when you have to move, that you would move, and that you will not always be there. So in Africa, some of the leaders are now thinking about eliminating the restrictions of movement on the continent, removing irrational things called visas and allowing people to move freely based on interactions. And I think that's a good thing. I think that's a good thing that helps to mitigate some of the pressures. If somebody feels they're part of a bigger thing, a bigger entity than the small one in which they are, then the likelihood of conflict reduces, in my view. So I see this studying pastoralists in Kenya, that when they have freedom to move from wherever we have drawn boundaries for counties and provinces and so on, when they have freedom to move and take care of the animals and get food and so on, there's less conflict. But conflict arises when then there's a drought, there's only one place where you can take your animals to get water, and there's a group that owns that space. And then there's a lot of conflict. So I think it is important for us, thinking politically, to start thinking about how do we ease the restrictions of movement as one way of mitigating conflict on the continent. Yeah.
I mean, similarly, it's, we have people in this room and elsewhere who says that they're practicing medical specialists or doctors, and they are not happy in their country they're in, and they want to come and practice in Johannesburg or in Nairobi.
Yeah.
So are you also advocating that we should be allowing mental health practitioners?
Thank you for that question.
We should talk about there's medical and dental health people that are stopping us from practicing
Thank you.
in Kenya and other places.
I have sat in meetings where government leaders have talked about a concept called brain drain. And I think it's a very insulting concept, because it says, in my country, we have such few brains that if somebody leaves my country and goes to work in another country, the brain is being drained. Because I will ask you, do you ever talk about brain drain when Dave comes from the US to South Africa and does work here? Is that brain drain? What do we call it? We call it capacity development, brain gain, collaboration, right? And we say, let's encourage that, isn't it? But if Bonga goes to Boston, we say brain drain. Like South Africa's very little brain is being drained into the US. So I find that to be problematic. And I think governments ought to make us want to work in their spaces by making it attractive for us to work in those spaces rather than creating boundaries and walls to prevent us from leaving. So I should work as I do in Nairobi because I enjoy working in Nairobi because the conditions are good for me to work in Nairobi, rather than because I can't work in South Africa or I can't work in the US or I can't work anywhere else. So I think that is something that we need to talk more about. Yeah.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Lukoye, can I have some questions, please? Can we start? Okay, we're starting that side. Thank you. John Parker. Maybe you can just introduce yourself, John. Thanks.
I think you've introduced me enough. Yeah, thank you. I'm John Parker. Thank you for the lovely talk. Yeah, I had a look at the literature a few years ago on climate change and mental health. And what struck me more than anything was more of the same. The problems we're struggling with will get worse, particularly related to climate disaster and PTSD, and then problems related to migration. And really the answers seem to be pretty much what we are already struggling for. Stronger communities, more functional families, better education, better resource delivery, all the things we talk about already. So yes, I agree completely. We absolutely need to foreground climate activism in the struggle for mental health care. But do you think we need to be doing anything differently when we do this?
Thank you very much. I think the only thing that we can do, I don't think we can do it differently, but is to make our voices more prominent. The fact that society places us on a pedestal, society respects the words that we use. We should use that more judiciously. We should be more visible in the space, because I see the visibility in the climate change space and climate action space is more political, more activists outside of health, and we are more modest about the things we say about the impact of climate change on health and on mental health. I think we need to be more visible, we need to be more vocal, and our voices still matter. That's what I think. Yeah.
Thank you. More questions? Professor Asmal?
Hi, I'm Leila. Thank you. That was great. So if we look at things globally, Africa's the least contributor to climate change, right? And we're one of the most quickest developing continents when it comes to urbanization. So a lot of the benefits, economic benefits of kind of doing the bad things around climate change, building factories, building fancy towns and all of that, we're gonna have to rethink things, and we're getting this top-down global, how are we gonna manage that? I really struggle with that because it feels like it's this kind of being told what to do when people have been reaping the benefits, but obviously we need to do the right thing.
Yeah.
I wanted your thoughts on that.
Thank you, Leila. It's a good problem to grapple with. I think we all struggle with that. But I think the struggle is because we have a fish that has thrived in the ocean, and we have taken it out and tried to put it into a competition of tree climbing. So we have a different concept of what is development, what is good. It's not the traditional what is good in Europe and in North America and so on. But we have been corralled into the mindset that what is good is huge cities, is skyscrapers, It's factories that belch out, carbon dioxide and so on. This is what we have been made to think, that this is what is good. But is it what is good? I don't know. I don't think it is what is good. I think we can contribute to the conversation about what development means and center the people in that conversation rather than centering industries, centering money, centering, I don't know, the economic framework that we inherited from Middle Age Europe. So I think we need to have a lot of conversation around what is good. And I think if you talk about development, you can have development that is good for the environment, that is in harmony with the environment. You can have development that doesn't contribute to pollution. You can have development that doesn't contribute to climate change. But not if we stick to the model of development that has been given to us from Europe and North America.
Are there any clinicians in the room? Or there's more questions aside? Because I just wanted to say that Lukoye also sees patients. So you can also ask him a little bit about what this means. I was just thinking if you see a client, a patient who lives in the city and is depressed, do you say to them, please go back to the rural areas and where there's vast amount of land and green, and does it help the way that you also conduct your clinical work?
So, and I think we discussed a bit of this in Nairobi over the past 3 days. Every patient encounter, in my own view, is an individual encounter, is a new encounter. And I think for a clinician, I would suggest that you learn as much from the patient as you might be able to teach. And so having done that, then you would take the patient's environment into consideration. You have to think about where do they live, how do they live, what are they going on as a context for whatever symptoms that they're going through. And indeed, a lot of the mental illnesses that we see clinically are worsened by your social context and where you live. And the thing about Kenya, I don't know if it is the same here, is that a huge number of people living in the cities also have a rural home. And around this time of the year, December and so on, there's a huge migration from the city to the rural area. And that has multiple benefits. Other than just going to the more rural, less concrete parts of the country, it also gives an opportunity for people to get rooted back in society, to be reminded about who they are, where they have come from, who they are connected to, and so on. And I find that that is therapeutic, in my view. So I don't explicitly tell people to leave the city and go to the rural area because obviously there are implications. But we speak about the connectedness. So most of the work right now on climate change must focus on youth, must focus on young people. And it shouldn't focus on young people as me, who is formerly young, telling, telling young people what to do. It has to center the voices of the youth. We have to have young people speaking, young people meaningfully participating in these conversations. Because what is being seen now is that the phenomenon known as solastalgia, or climate anxiety, or fear about what the future looks like with the climate change that's going on, is predominantly among young people. The older folk don't have that kind of anxiety, I mean, for the most part. And so we need to hear see. And the second thing that I would put there is that we know from dealing with anxiety, dealing with worries and so on, that doing something about it helps. It's therapeutic. So starting to plan and thinking about, I'm going to do this in order to mitigate this problem that is causing me anxiety, helps to reduce anxiety. And so it makes perfect sense that young people must be at the forefront in providing solutions and also acting in climate change. I'm very happy that today for these conferences that are organized to discuss climate change, there are now very active youth and active groups of youth that are participating front and center in providing suggestions and solutions for this problem. So I think I agree with you 100% that a way to deal with the climate anxieties among the young people is to get the young people more active in proposing solutions and providing those solutions. Yeah, and among us as health workers, I would be happier seeing more young people taking the lead. I know that when I was a fresh psychiatry graduate, I would attend a meeting like this and sit at the back very timidly listening and being awed by the older folk. And I know that I realized that that was a mistake. And when I started interacting more with them, I gained a lot. And I think many young people need to do that a little bit more. And I thank Bonga because for this meeting, there are many, many young people who have been sponsored to attend. There are many young people who are being supported to attend and to speak. We are going to hear from them. And that's as it should be, in my view. Yeah.
So in South Africa, you'd still be young. You're definitely in the youth league still. There's a question at the back. Stay there, the right at the back. Oh, is it next?
Here first? Okay.
If you can just introduce yourself, Lihle, please. Thanks.
There you are. It
Okay.
is now.
Okay. Good morning, everyone. My name is Lihle Mkweba Bewan. Prof, thank you so much for a very enlightening presentation. My question is also a youth. It's also around, because tech, AI. What do you think is the role of tech and AI in this endeavor of us trying to mitigate the effect of climate change and mental health challenges? Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. A lot of the conversations around technology and mental health have been negative conversations. I have read editorials that speak about the negative effects of screen time on children, about the dangers, potential dangers of AI in healthcare. And these are all true and they're all real. However, I think we as humans have always been social. And in fact, we are human because we are social. In the past, when we didn't have methods of reaching out to people who are far from us, we used to organize market days on this continent. And it is during market days that we would congregate at a space, exchange things, but also exchange information and exchange gossip. Gossip. It's a very important part of being human. Meeting somebody and asking them about what's happening with somebody else. It's absolutely important. And it has always been important. In fact, how we have evolved as a society is only because of that kind of gossip. Those that didn't do that, or people who were unable to do that, did not live long enough to reproduce and pass on those traits. So, technology only serves to facilitate that. Technology creates new marketplaces with people that you would otherwise never have met. It creates spaces for discussing topics that you would otherwise have never discussed. And it creates potential avenues for getting help that you would otherwise never have gotten. So I think there are humans who are evil, who look for tools to harm other humans. They have always been there. But then the vast majority of humans are really just looking to do the best thing, to do the right thing. And in talking about AI and tech, the humans who are looking to do good must continue to do that, must not be afraid, must not be made scared by the potential dangers of these tools that we have now at our disposal. I think we can use them for good. One of the things I think AI looks promising for, with huge volumes of data, is to help us better understand mental illness. Because currently we classify mental illness. We try and do surveys and collect data and see what's common, what's different, how do you cluster things together. AI can do that 1,000,000 times better than we can based on the data. So I'm seeing a role in the next few years of AI helping us to figure out, is schizophrenia one thing, or is it 10 things, or is it 100 things, based on how it presents, based on the people who get it, based on how they respond to the various interventions that we have. AI can do that much better than we can. AI can figure out a patient sitting in front of me, what kind of intervention would they best benefit from, rather than me relying on my rapidly degenerating brain to make that determination. So there are benefits, and I think we need to focus on what good we can do with it, rather than worrying extremely about what evils and what negative things can come out of it. I say this when I've been asked, do you think radiologists will be replaced by AI? Do you think psychiatrists will be replaced by AI? Do you think doctors will be? I think doctors who don't use AI will be replaced by doctors who use AI.
And also AI will help us think about this question that we have for this conference, and we're looking forward to, there's another talk that's going to be looking at how we use machine learning to look at impact of mental health, impact of climate change on mental health outcomes.
Precisely.
So we've got time for 2 more questions. Maybe we can just take, now the hands are shooting up. Stay is got the microphone, so maybe we'll take your question and that guy at the back. Thanks. Yeah, stay.
Morning.
Morning.
Thank you, Prof. So my question goes to Mau Mau psychology, now the freedom fighters' history. But in terms of genetic pattern, what are the
Sorry,
mental...
did you introduce yourself? Apologies.
Sorry.
I didn't hear
My
you.
name is Linda Kayura Michani from Kenya, a clinical psychologist.
Welcome.
Mental health impact, effect on the Mau Mau generation. Yeah.
Yeah. So the Mau Mau are a product of the environment. So just to give a brief for those who might not know, is that the group being called Mau Mau was early adults in the 40s. And many of them were then rounded up by the British colonial government and taken into what was then called the King's African Rifles. And they were sent to go and fight in the Second World War, many of them. And before that, as I told you, the British had a mission of civilizing the natives with the British government, religion, morals, whatever, and so on. And so one of the things that they inculcated in the population is the superiority of the white man, and the fact that he breathed differently, he ate differently, he didn't bleed, he didn't die normally, and so on. So these young men were sent to go and fight Italians, to go and fight Germans, and so on and so forth. And they saw them die, they saw them feel cold in the trenches, they saw them afraid, and they saw them cower before them when they were confronting them. And when they came back to Kenya, they were demobilized, they were sent back into the communities, and they started challenging the narrative that this guy is different. And they started banding together and saying, some of the things that this guy does here are not things that a person should do to another person. And so they started the resistance. That's where they came from. And obviously the suppression of that resistance was brutal. It's been documented by people like Caroline Elkins, David Anderson, on this circumstances that they were, put under by the British. And so obviously, there are many post-traumatic syndromes that emanate from that kind of treatment for that generation itself. So post-traumatic stress disorder was very high. I told you 2/3 of them had PTSD symptoms, significant PTSD symptoms, almost 50 years after the incarceration. But there were other things as well: depression, substance use disorders, adjustment disorders, and so on. Many of them, when they came back from the concentration camps, went back to their villages, they found that their property had been taken away. So there were collaborators, so-called collaborators in those areas who were friendly to the British, and they were given the property of those that were resistant. Some of them, men, had just newly married before they were incarcerated, and when they came back, they found that their wives had gotten married to other people, and so on and so forth. So they lived a life of being displaced psychologically and physically, all their lives. But this didn't end with them. They got children, and they lived in extreme adversity even then. And in the 90s, and perhaps this side of the millennium, there emerged another group that were children and grandchildren of those Mau Mau. This group was called Mungiki. These were the children of the Mau Mau or the grandchildren of the Mau Mau. Having gone through a life of adversity, having parents who had no idea about how to live except in violence and in adversity, this formed gangs which started terrorizing urban settings in Nairobi, in central Kenya, and so on. And again, government reaction was to suppress them with force. So many of them were tracked down, they were shot, they were hunted, and so on. And so the cycle continues. And so a lot of the urban crime we are seeing in Nairobi, you can link it all the way back to the Mau Mau. And the same traumas, the same post-traumatic syndromes that their fathers and grandfathers had are transmitted from that generation to the current generation. So that's how I would put it.
Thank you very much, Lukoye.
Thank you.
Last question, please, and if you can introduce yourself, and then a brief question, please. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you, Professor Atwoli. By name, I'm Lawrence Were from Kenya and Boston as well. Thank you very much for your talk. And I think you made two things very clear, that we are a product of our history and that we need to focus on the youth. And it almost, as you just said in your last point, we keep perpetuating these histories of trauma and we're a product of our environment. How do we break this cycle to be able to at least turn a corner and move in a different direction, whether it's on mental health, whether it's on climate change, migration, all those issues that we have on the table?
Thank you very much. I think the first step in changing things is to become aware of them. Because most humans go through life assuming that their reactions are automatic and that they don't think about how they respond to situations in the environment. But when you stop to think about it, that's the first step in changing the situation. So I think we have to agree that first, we are not living normal lives in our settings, and that a lot of the things we have gone through are not normal things. And therefore, our responses have not been what would be expected to live a fulfilling life. And once we agree, then we would begin to question how we educate our children. We are having a conversation in Kenya about, and I asked the Ministry of Education officials, why do we take our children to school? What is the philosophy of our education system? So in Kenya, the education system is based on the colonial principle that we are creating a workforce for the government, or for the colonial government, for the administration. So, and today we are talking about competency-based education, and the competences are how do you serve the master. So that's the philosophy of the education system. But we don't think about it. So if you start thinking about it, then you say, aha, okay, so we need an education system that prepares people who would be well adjusted to the environment in which we are, who would live fulfilling lives, and who will contribute meaningfully to society. We would think about that, but we don't, because we assume it is just automatic. You're born, you go to school, you go to university, you get a job, and you get money, and then you restart the cycle by getting your own children. But if you think about it, then you might start changing things. The same with how we organize our politics, the same with how we interact with our neighbors. I'll finish with just one example of some of the automatisms that I see across the continent. Many assume that the construct of race, the construct of ethnicity is a biological construct, and it's automatic and it's fixed. But then in my country, I have asked, if we stopped looking at your ethnicity from where your father came from, and if we just flipped it and said, let's do it from where your mother came from, what would your ethnic community be? And for many people, it would be very different. So my father has linkages to Maasai, to Luo, and to Luhya people in Kenya. My mother had linkages to Luo and Luhya. And the Maasai lineage that we trace ourselves back to also had Nandi lineage and connections. Now, if I stop assuming my father and his father and so on, where they came from, and I just looked at their mothers, my ethnicity would be different. And I would argue for most people that that would still be the case. But because we assume it is automatic, we assume it's in the blood, and we respond as if that is a fact, that's something that we can think about and change. So I think to summarize and answer your question is that the first step in changing the situation is to stop making assumptions and to think more critically about the decisions we make and the basis of those decisions. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Lukoye.